e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, g6, c4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, f3. Out of opening book, bishop e2 would have been in the Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, accelerated dragon, Maroczy bind, opening line. Knight takes d4. Queen takes d4. Pins black's knight at f6. White wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Bishop g7 makes way for a castle to the king side. Bishop e3, Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, accelerated dragon, Maroczy bind, Gurganidze variation, transposed, opening line. Castle kingside, Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, accelerated dragon, Maroczy bind, Gurganidze variation, opening line. Queen d2, out of opening book. a5, b3, a4, b4, bishop e6, rook c1, knight d7, bishop e2 makes way for a castle to the king side, knight b6, knight b5, a3, knight d4, bishop d7, h4, h5, g4, h takes g4, isolates white's pawn at h4. F takes g4. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. e5 attacks white's knight. Knight b3 moves it to safety and threatens black's pawn at d6. Bishop c6 protects black's pawn at d6 and threatens white's pawn at e4. Bishop f3 protects white's pawn at e4. f5 pins white's pawn at e4. G takes f5. Releases white's pawn at e4 from the pin, attacks black's pawn at g6 and isolates black's pawn at g6. G takes f5, pins white's pawn at e4 and isolates white's pawn at e4. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Knight a5. f4 attacks white's bishop at e3 and creates a passed pawn on f4. Bishop f2 moves it to safety. Knight a4. Knight takes c6, threatens black's queen. B takes c6, protects black's queen. Black wins a knight for a bishop. Material is even. Castle kingside. Slightly better is h5. c5. b5. Creates a passed pawn on b5. Bishop f6. King h1. Knight b6. Blocks white's pawn at b5. Rook c d1. King h8. Queen takes d6. Threatens black's pawn at c5 with a double attack and isolates black's pawn at c5. Queen takes d6. Removes the threat on black's pawn at c5. Rook takes d6. Forks black's knight and black's pawn at c5. Knight takes c4. Attacks white's rook at d6 and creates a passed pawn on c5. Black wins a queen and a pawn for a queen and a pawn. Material is even. Rook d5. Moves it to safety. Knight e3. Forks white's rook at f1 and white's rook at d5. Bishop takes e3. Removes the threat on white's rook at d5 and white's rook at f1. F takes e3. Advances the passed pawn. Bishop e2. Partially pins black's bishop and blocks black's pawn at e3. Bishop takes h4. Rook f5. Rook takes f5. Removes the threat on black's pawn at e5. E takes f5. Attacks black's pawn at e5 and creates a passed pawn on f5. Rook d8. Attacks white's rook. Rook takes d8 check. Checks black's king. Bishop takes d8. Removes the threat on black's king. Black wins 2 rooks, a bishop, and a pawn for 2 rooks and a knight. Black is up a pawn in material. King g2. King g7. King f3. Threatens black's pawn at e3. King f6. Threatens white's pawn at f5 and blocks white's pawn at f5. King e4. Removes the threat on white's pawn at f5 and blocks black's pawn at e5. c4. Advances the passed pawn. Bishop takes c4. White wins a pawn. Material is even. Bishop b6. Removes the threat on black's pawn at e3 and blocks white's pawn at b5. Bishop d3. The game ends in a draw.